Okay, so when we last left off, Benjamin Franklin was representing the colonists in front of Parliament in hopes to repeal the Stamp Act. Well, Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act, but on the same day that they repeal the Stamp Act, they pass something known as the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act says to the colonists, listen, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we want you to know that we do have the right to tax you, and we will do so in the future. Well, that future comes 1 year later in 1767. When Charles Townshend, who's pictured here, who was the chief financial minister in Parliament, they pass a series of taxes on imported goods. So these were new taxes on goods that were being imported into the colonies. These become known as the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts are going to bring about protests in the colonies. The money that was going to be raised by the Townshend Acts would go to pay royal governors and judges. And the idea was that if the governors and judges were being paid by the revenue from the taxes, that they would be less dependent on the colonial legislatures where previously they were getting paid from. The Townshend Acts also set up a new board of customs commissioners. These customs commissioners would be local British officials who would be there in the colonies to collect taxes and also try to put an end to smuggling. So protest to the Townshend Acts does not happen as quickly as it does for the Stamp Act, but eventually, over time, it builds up. One of the men who had played a role in doing that was John Dickinson. John Dickinson is pictured here. John Dickinson wrote a series of letters known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And in these letters, he argued that there's no difference between an indirect or direct tax or internal and external tax. Basically, he argued Parliament doesn't have the right to tax the colonists because the colonists are not represented there. Well, in Boston, the Sons of Liberty and their leader, Samuel Adams is pictured here. Samuel Adams writes something that's now known as the Circular Letter. And the Circular Letter basically argues that Parliament doesn't have the right to tax the colonists and would never have the right to tax the colonists. Well, the Massachusetts Assembly passes this Circular Letter, and when that happens, the royal governor dissolves the legislature. And when he does this, he loses control of the city. And when he loses control of the city, Parliament decides to send in British troops. This is an engraving done by Paul Revere to show British troops landing in Boston. Well, these British troops, Boston's basically going to become a garrison town. So colonists are going to have to walk through these checkpoints, guarded checkpoints, to get throughout the city. But another thing that led to conflict between the troops and the citizens of Boston was the fact that British troops could work odd jobs when they weren't on duty. And this way they could make more money. So they took jobs from the colonists, but they also drove down salaries in Boston, and this greatly upset many colonists. Well, this tension between the troops and the colonists is going to come to a head on March 5th, 1770, in what we now know as the Boston Massacre. If you look here, this is a piece of propaganda that was done by Paul Revere known as the Bloody Massacre. And here you can see troops lined up in a line who were firing on British colonists. Boston Massacre was basically a snowball fight that turned deadly when the British troops fired into a crowd and killed 5 colonists. And as you can see here, this was something that was reported throughout the colonies is going to be one step closer to uniting the colonists and the different colonies against the British Parliament. The last casket on the right there, CA, stands for Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was the first person to die in the Boston Massacre. He was a Boston colonist who came from Indian, African, and white blood, and now is known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. Well, British merchants were so hurt by this boycott of British goods that they convinced Parliament to repeal the Townshend taxes, and Parliament does. They repeal all taxes except one, the tax on tea. Now, in 1773, under Lord North, who's now in charge of Parliament, the Parliament passes something known as the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act of 1773 is not a new tax. What it does is it gives the East India Company a monopoly over selling tea in the colonies. And it gives them rebates and tax cuts that allow them to sell tea cheaper in the colonies than anyone else. Now, even though this wasn't a new tax, the colonists come to resent it. They come to resent it because, one, it hurts local merchants because the East India Tea Company could now sell tea cheaper than the local merchants, and it also hurts smugglers. But more than that, colonists begin to think that if they pay this tax, then they are agreeing with Parliament that Parliament has the right to tax them. So they begin to protest the Tea Act. Well, that comes to a head on December 16, 1773, when, once again, Boston, there is something that we now know as the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party was Sons of Liberty who dressed up as Native Americans and dumped what today would be $4 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. And when this happens, the British Parliament realizes that they must act, and they do act swiftly. Lord North, who's pictured here, says, "The time has come for us to demonstrate whether we have or have not any authority in that country." So Parliament is going to pass a series of acts that become known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. The first of the Intolerable Acts is the closing of the Port of Boston. Boston Port is closed until the legislature pays back the cost of the tea that was dumped into Boston Harbor. Another one suspends town hall meetings and no longer allows the citizens of Massachusetts colony to have town meetings that they had all the way back, dating back to the Mayflower Compact. It also gives the royal governor the ability to appoint previously elected officials. So officials that were previously elected by the people of Massachusetts are now going to be appointed by the governor, which does not make the people of Massachusetts happy. Next, they pass a new quartering act that now gives commanders the ability to house soldiers in private homes. All these acts become known as the Intolerable Acts. And here you can see in this political cartoon, Lord North is forcing this teapot of the Intolerable Acts, which represents the Intolerable Acts, down the throat of Massachusetts colony. And you can see Massachusetts colony is being held down by Parliament. There's somebody else in the background holding a sword that says military law, and you see Lady Liberty shielding her eyes from what's happening.